Hello and welcome to Season 7 of Buffy and the Art of Story, a podcast that recaps one episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer at a time, focusing on its story elements. This time I'm looking at Season 7, Episode 11, Showtime, where more potential Slayers arrive and Buffy fights the Turok Han, this time with an audience. I am Lisa M. Lilly, author of the Awakening Supernatural thriller series, the QC Davis crime novels, and the Writing as a Second Career books for writers, as well as the founder of Writing as a Second Career.com. Along with the recap of Showtime, today we'll talk about foreshadowing within your story to make later developments compelling and believable, just-in-time world building, good ways to answer audience questions, and how to gradually change character relationships. As always, there will be no spoilers except in the foreshadowing section at the end, but I'll give you plenty of warning. Remember, if you'd like to get more content, you can join the Patreon community at patreon.com/Lisa M. Lilly. That's Lisa, M as in Marie, Lilly. Okay, let's dive into the Hellmouth. Showtime aired the first time on January 7, 2003. It was written by David Fury and directed by Michael Grossman. It starts with some opening conflict that is reminiscent of Faith's arrival in Los Angeles in the companion show Angel. Feet descend the stairs of a bus at night. The camera pans and we see it is a girl or young woman. I don't know her age. We'll find out later her name is Rona. And she finds a public phone and looks for Summers in the phone book, which is a really nice way to make clear where she is and who she is. But before she finds the listing, a bringer attacks. She backs away in fear, but Buffy arrives. She fights the bringer as well as one of its companions, kills the last one with a knife throw, and introduces herself. And Rona says, "You're her." And Buffy says, "Her is me." Rona says they told her she'd be safe here, and Buffy agrees she'll be safer with Buffy around, quote, "next time you're attacked," end quote. Rona is shocked. Is Buffy saying she'll be attacked again? And Buffy says, "Welcome to the Hellmouth," a nice reference to the title of the pilot of the series. And we go to credits. On return at the Summers house, Willow is tossing and turning on her bedroom floor. Kennedy, in bed, tells Willow she doesn't need to sleep there. The bed is very comfortable, and she pats the bed next to herself. Kennedy says Willow looks uncomfortable, or is it just her? Willow claims she's only uneasy because Buffy's out finding another potential Slayer. They talk about how it's getting crowded there with all the potentials, which leads into Kennedy's comment that as a kid, she didn't have to share a bathroom. Her half-sister's room was in a different wing of the house. Kennedy asks Willow about being a witch. She says it sounds new agey. And she wants Willow to do a trick, pull a rabbit out of a hat or make something float. Willow is a little taken aback both by Kennedy's clearly very wealthy upbringing and all her questions, making light of magic as she doesn't know Willow's history. We now reach the story spark or inciting incident that gets the main plot rolling. Usually we see it by 10% through an episode. It's a little bit later here, and it's subtle, but ultimately really powerful. At 5 minutes in, the potentials are in sleeping bags in the living room. One of them tells the others about how Annabelle scolded them all about controlling their fear and then ran off and got killed. A potential we haven't seen before named Eve says, "Great. The Slayer who's supposed to protect them all let Annabelle get killed." Watching this to prepare for the podcast, I put a note the first time and said, is that the story spark? Because I didn't remember how the plot developed. And then when I went back through to write a more detailed outline, I realized, yes, that is exactly the spark, because Eve begins fanning the flames of doubt about Buffy. For the moment, though, the others argue that Buffy couldn't stop it. It wasn't her fault. She got there too late. They also tell Eve that Buffy looked like a giant bruise even a day after trying to fight the Uber vamp. Eve asks why it's been an hour since Buffy left to get the new girl, and with a worried look on her face, asks if they think Buffy might have been too late again. Not only is this good conflict as she makes the others uneasy with what are pretty reasonable questions for these new potential slayers. They don't know Buffy. But this is also foreshadowing that it is already too late for the real Eve, because as we'll find out much later, this is not Eve, this is the first. Xander, who is on the sofa, suggests they all sleep. Potential slayers can function without sleep, but he needs rest. Andrew, still tied to that chair, wants them to keep it down or speak more loudly so he can hear. So he's apparently been tied to that chair all night. This is adding to the discomfort I expressed, I think, last episode about how the gang is treating Andrew. Buffy and Rona arrive. Rona asks why that guy is tied to a chair. Xander says the question is, why isn't he gagged? A few of the girls, along with Rona, head to the kitchen. Buffy tells Giles about the welcoming committee at the bus station and says the first is always one step ahead. A little more foreshadowing, as unknown to her, the first really is a step ahead as Eve is sitting there in the house. Buffy says she needs to know how to stop the first, and Giles has no answers. He's exhausted all his sources, and the Watchers' records are all they have. Anya chimes in that she made the rounds of the demon community. The ones who didn't attack her either didn't know or didn't talk. Buffy asks, what about the Turok Han? Stakes won't kill it, but is there anything in the books about what does? Andrew asks, with the Turok Han guarding the entrance to the crypt, how will Buffy get to Spike? And Eve says, Spike? Sorry, I'm confused. And she goes on to ask, isn't he the vampire who's been killing people? And that's who Buffy's worried about helping? Buffy tries to explain that they need Spike, but then she says it's complicated. She calls Eve Chloe. Chloe reminds Buffy who she is. And this is another way to get the names of the potential slayers in. I think as well it is echoing the audience's concerns about not being able to remember who these girls are. In a way, it signals that it's okay because Buffy doesn't remember them either, and maybe we don't need to know one from the other that well. Eve asks if there's a plan, any kind of plan to keep them from dying. So she is gradually sowing more and more seeds of doubt, yet I know the first time I didn't suspect anything was off with Eve because she just seemed understandably frightened, as anyone in her spot would be. Buffy looks uncomfortable and says they're working on it. She looks to Giles. Giles tells them about a sort of oracle called Beljax's Eye. It's in an internal vortex, and only demons can open the gateway. He wants Anya to help. She protests she's only an ex-demon, and Giles tells her she still has friends in the fold, and then adds, quote, murderous acquaintances anyway, unquote. But Anya doesn't think it's likely to have answers. Buffy pleads with her. They're running out of time. Spike is running out of time. A good segue to Spike, who is cuffed to a wall in a cave. A bringer swings his sword at him, but Spike fights back and breaks free. He runs through the underground tunnels. He sees Buffy waiting. The music becomes soft and romantic. There's soft lighting, but it's a dream. The first pulls him out of it, looking like Buffy for now, and says, dreaming of me again, are you? Poor Spike. He still thinks I believe in him. The first goes on to say Buffy doesn't believe in herself enough to risk her own skin to save Spike because she'd have to face that, and motions to the Turok Han, which growls and then careens out of the frame. Spike, though, keeps muttering to himself, she will come for me. The first, as Buffy, still caresses his face, which I guess that he can't feel, and says, no, I won't. We're at 11 minutes 33 seconds through the episode, just a little past a quarter way through. That's where typically you find a turn that spins the story in a new direction, comes from outside the protagonist, and raises the stakes. To an extent, we get that here, although the raising the stakes will come a little bit further in. For now, Giles and Anya go find a demon who's named Torg to open the portal. Torg is not too inclined to help, though. Anya broke his heart. She jokingly points out he doesn't have a heart, and then says it was just one night, but he really fell for her. He remembers she wore pink. She says those were entrails. As Giles rolls his eyes, Anya offers sex if Torg will open the portal, but he is repulsed. She's human now and looks disgusting. She's offended he rejected her bribe of sexual favors and asks, what is she, a leper? This is a reference to Spike turning her down in the previous episode. Torg tells her to come back when she is a leper. Giles has had it. He tells Torg the Slayer will not kill him and burn his business down if he opens the portal. Torg, looking angry, makes a fist. A large claw bursts out of his knuckle. We think he might punch Giles, but instead he shoots his arm out and opens the portal. And Anya says, it's the hair, right? Not attractive? Giles says, come on, and they enter. This spins the story in that Giles and Anya are now going somewhere to seek answers. So outside of Buffy, and the answer will raise the stakes in mainly an emotional sense. It's windy, it's dark inside the portal. Beljax's eye is a giant eye in sort of this cage, and there's a bunch of other eyes around it, and it's really gross looking, and I have a whole eye phobia thing, so it creeps me out. The scene cuts to Willow, who answers the phone. She's really excited to hear someone from the Coven back in England. We cut to Buffy telling Andrew she doesn't know what to do with him, but they've got no time to babysit a hostage, so she will free him, but she warns him not to try to fight or run away and asks if he's ever seen Misery, which is the movie made from the Stephen King novel of the same name. And Andrew says 6 times, but the book was scarier than the movie because instead of crushing his foot with the sledgehammer, Kathy Bates chops it off with, and then he says he'll be good. I agree with Andrew. The book was scarier than the movie, including because of what Andrew said. And it's one of the few Stephen King movies that I thought did a great job of capturing the story of the book and the characters while still telling the story in its own way and without being too wedded to the book. That is got to be really challenging for screenwriters, especially with a Stephen King book, because he puts so much in there. The characters are so developed. We learn so much backstory, and you just cannot get it all in a movie. So if you try to track it too closely, it feels bogged down in a way the novel doesn't, and you still can't get it all in there. You need to keep the story and yet tell it in a different way. And I thought both the book and the movie were excellent, though definitely very dark. Willow tells them all that there's a new potential who got to town 2 days ago. She's at a hotel. The Bringers killed her Watcher before the Watcher could alert Buffy. Buffy and Xander rush off to find her before the Bringers get to her. Dawn's not too thrilled about another girl showing up, but Willow says the more help, the better. And Dawn realistically responds, not sure more scared Slayer wannabes translates as help. And now we cut to the scared Slayer wannabes who are training in the basement. Train is kind of a loose term for it because for the moment they don't have much guidance. They're flipping stakes, they're dropping things. Only Kennedy seems excited. Eve asks, what are they doing? And Kennedy says, it's training. Didn't her Watcher tell her what the word means? But Eve means, why bother? They'll never be able to slay vampires. None of them have ever even seen a vampire, though one says she saw one in a photograph. They talk about the Slayer line and how a potential is activated only when the previous Slayer died. That term activated, remember in the beginning, it was to every generation a Slayer is born, not activated. Granted, activated doesn't have a ring to it, but I feel like until we get Kendra, the idea was that there would be just one Slayer for a generation, which is about 16 years. Introducing the idea that there could be more than one in the world who could become a Slayer when the other dies is an example of just-in-time world building. I can't remember if I've talked about that before, but there is world building for a fantasy story or sci-fi or horror where you figure out in advance what are the parameters of this world, what are the rules of this world. And then there is putting in just enough to get you started and evolving the world as you go. And some writers are super planners. Others do everything on the fly. As I am with plotting, I'm kind of in the middle there. I don't plan everything. I like to leave openings and evolve. And adding Kendra and Faith, and then this idea that you could have a whole bunch of potentials, strikes me as a bit of that just-in-time world building. It's not so completely different from the one Slayer in every generation. It's just a little bit different, and it's enough that I think the audience isn't thrown by it. The reason in season 7 I struggled is having Kendra show up when Buffy died and then Faith after Kendra died still fit with other parts of the mythology. We always knew like a Slayer's died, the next one's called. But having so many, we never really had a sense that, oh, there are so many out there, or maybe just never thought about it. Because if you do think about it, there must have been a bunch because Faith isn't that much older than Kendra. Kendra is roughly the same age as Buffy. But bringing in all these potentials really shifts that. And it's a good example of staying within the world that you have created, but growing it. And we're going to find out a little bit more about the whole Slayers line through Beljox's eye as well. A long way of saying that overall, I think the show does a good job of building on and expanding the mythology. If the show had ended at the end of season 5, we never would have got to this idea of, oh, there are not just a few potential Slayers, there are tons and tons of them out there right now. Eve now says that they're all just waiting to die as they'll be activated one by one. One of the potentials says she heard there's another Slayer somewhere, which confuses all of them more. I loved this reference to Faith without actually mentioning her. Chloe worries about being the next one because she feels she is too young. Kennedy, on the other hand, worries she might be too old. But Eve says they'll just run through them one after another, and all they're doing is waiting around for each other to die. This is a good segue, the reference to dying, more foreshadowing, because now we are going to see the real Eve, who is dead. At 18 minutes 4 seconds, Buffy knocks on a hotel room door, gets no answer. Xander looks through the window and tells Buffy to break down the door, and inside they find a dead potential. They turn her over, and it's Eve. Back at the house, ominous music plays as the girls now all sit in a circle in the basement. No one's even trying to train. And Eve says, just my personal opinion, but I don't think the Slayer can protect us from the first. Great example of dramatic irony where we know something the characters don't. And also real irony because this is the first saying this. And clearly at the moment, this is true. And we cut to a commercial. On return, Andrew asks Dawn, why are all the Slayers girls? He says it'd be cool if there was a guy could protect them from Ninja X. Dawn gets mad when he says that Buffy couldn't. She can't even slay that new type of vampire. And he asks, why is Buffy trying to save Spike? He's a way worse killer than Andrew by a lot. Dawn says Spike was controlled by the first, and he has a soul now, plus they need Spike's help. This is a great example of having a character pose questions the audience might have, and Dawn responds. I also like Dawn in this role of defending Buffy, or maybe I'd rather say advocating for Buffy. And I wish we saw more of this, because it could be a good way to get Buffy's motives and feelings out there. Buffy is not an oversharer with her emotions, and we could use Dawn pushing back against Andrew or even the potentials more than we do. I believe that Dawn knows Buffy, senses things about Buffy that others don't, and this could have been a really nice way to bring that out. This episode, I feel, is pretty tightly written, but the last few episodes, I commented on all the repetition we had there. We could have used a little more of this kind of thing where Dawn is there pushing back and giving us more of Buffy's perspective when Buffy won't. If you're looking for help plotting your own story or novel or fleshing out your characters, check out the Writing as a Second Career books. They include creating compelling characters from the inside out, super simple story structure, and the 1-year novelist. And if you're having trouble getting started, or you're stuck in the middle of your novel, you might find Write On How to Overcome Writer's Block So You Can Write Your Novel helpful. They're all under my clever nonfiction name, L.M. Lilly. You can find them at writingasasecondcareer.com in your local library. Order them online or follow links on my author website, lisalilly.com. The Dawn-Andrew interactions show another thing that is really useful to do in fiction, which is when two characters have a strained relationship, which is putting it mildly for Dawn and Spike, they sometimes will realign if now a third person is more or less attacking them or raising questions. Dawn very rightly was so angry at Spike in season 6 after what he did to Buffy. She threatened him in season 7. She has been suspicious of him and not ready to trust him and work with him again. And she had doubts about Buffy keeping him at the Summers house. But now that Andrew is raising objections, and earlier Eve was questioning what Buffy was doing about Spike, Dawn shifts her position. She is aligned with Buffy, and by saying the things Buffy would say and putting herself in the position to argue that, she is now becoming more aligned with Spike again, a step toward shifting that relationship yet again. And that is a really good way if you want to bring two characters who are at odds into alignment again, is to have them face either a common enemy or opposition from someone else, so that it forces them to reconsider or to get back in touch with what they liked, loved, admired about that other character that they have been at odds with. Andrew now says, what about me? Did it ever occur to anyone that I could be a lot more useful around here? I used to be an evil genius. Hello. And Dawn says, and what was your genius thing? And Andrew responds, well, raising demons mostly. Okay, so not for now, but also there was planning. There were blueprints. Dawn looks very skeptical, and he ends with, I can be in this, kicking it righteous. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Dawn says, Buffy said if you talked enough, I'm allowed to kill you. They keep bickering. Andrew rambles into James Bond and Timothy Dalton and the Broccoli's, and Dawn asks if there is a language that he's speaking. Andrew says, I'm so alone, and Dawn responds, then maybe you shouldn't have killed your only friend. Great insight from Dawn, and it's especially powerful because it does that flip from that kind of goofiness and silliness and annoyance and bickering to a very emotional point, a truth that Dawn says. For now, Andrew doesn't quite take that in, although he says he hates that, but he quickly adds Buffy's not getting it done. He's got his ear to the ground, and that's the word. Andrew is not wrong about that, which is a little bit of irony because Andrew's so goofy and he rambles on and no one's going to take him seriously, but he is listening and he is correct. The potentials are not feeling that Buffy is able to handle this. Buffy comes home, peers around looking for Eve, looks Andrew's way and kind of glares, and he sits up and pats the couch because he had laid down on the couch and put his feet on it. Buffy scoffs at him and heads for the basement. That's the kind of humor with Andrew that I enjoy. And we're at the midpoint of the episode. Typically there we'll see a major reversal for the protagonist or a major commitment or both. You could see it as finding Eve dead, and Buffy didn't recognize that the Eve in the house was the first. But because this is about the potentials losing faith in Buffy and how Buffy handles that, the midpoint comes when she and Xander go into the basement and Buffy tells Eve to get away from the others. They are confused, ask what Eve did, and Buffy tells them Eve is dead. So this moment where the first now undermines Buffy further, this is the major reversal because Buffy didn't know. And the first, we find out, has been there for days. So the first, as Eve says, too bad, quote, one more down, and goes on that you can't save them all, right, Buffy? And she thanks the potentials for the slumber party, says she learned a lot, and tells them she'll send a guest to visit after the sun goes down, and says to make him feel welcome before he rips them all to pieces. So this makes it seem almost impossible that Buffy could get these potentials' confidence back, or that she can protect them. It looks like they're all going to get killed tonight. The scene cuts to Anya and Giles with Beljox's eye, and it tells them the first evil can't be fought or killed. It has always been and always will be since before the universe began. It will exist long after all else is gone. Giles refuses to believe it can't be destroyed, and we get a little more humor here because the eye has been very ominous and foreboding, but now it says, what am I talking to myself here? There's no way. Anya wants to leave. Giles asks if the eye is saying the first will succeed in wiping out the line of slayers. And the eye says the eye sees not the future, only the truth of the now and before. Anya says they've all got that. It's memory. Can't the eye help out with something more demony? Giles asks why the first is acting now if it's always been around. This is a key question and one that I remember having that I suspect almost all audience members have. The first has been there forever. We saw it in season 2, and the question is, why now? And it's important to answer that for the viewers. Otherwise, it just seems random. And the eye now says the opportunity only recently presented itself. The forces around the chosen one are irrevocably altered and unstable. And the first seized on that to extinguish the Slayer line. Giles asks what caused that, and the eye says the Slayer, which is a great hook because we now cut to a different scene. As is so often the case, Giles is the one who had to get out the exposition earlier and explain about Beljox's eye, and you need a demon to open it. The writers tried to use some conflict to help bring that out, that conflict between Anya and Giles, where Anya is resisting. She says she can't open the portal, and the eye won't have anything to say. I don't think that works as well as usually it does to bring out conflict through exposition, because there isn't ever really any reason why Anya doesn't want to try. I could guess that maybe she's discouraged from her previous attempts to get info from the demon world. Maybe she's feeling bad that she doesn't fit there anymore, but we don't really get that. And so it doesn't ring true that Anya initially opposes the idea, and even now, as soon as the eye says something, she's like, okay, let's go. And Giles says, no, I want to ask more questions. I would have liked just something. Is there something about that oracle she's afraid of? Because Anya's not afraid of much. That would have added a lot, because we do have quite a bit of exposition. The conflict with the eye works better for me. It's an oracle. It's vague. It's not giving straight answers. That seems to work. That is how in the Buffyverse oracles are. So you do get some push and pull there. So it's not just flat out exposition. We cut to the potentials gathered around a table, everyone worrying about what to do with the Turok Han coming that night. Should they run? But Annabelle got killed that way. And then they talk about how Eve was there for days living with them and Buffy didn't notice. This is one of my other issues with the first, not so much with this episode, but it strains credulity that nobody noticed. I did check, and when they're all on those sleeping bags, Eve is on top of a sleeping bag. She's not in it, so she's not physically moving that sleeping bag, but there's a lot of people in that house. It's hard to believe someone didn't brush against Eve and not notice that there was no Eve to brush against, or that she always managed to not touch anything, eat anything, do anything that set anyone off. It's possible, but there's always a part of my brain that's saying, well, come on, how could that be? Maybe if they could have shown us a little example of it. I don't know how you would do that, though, but that is something I struggle with. And I'm thinking I'm going to do a bonus episode about the first for the whole season, kind of what works, what doesn't, what I feel is challenging about it as a big bad. For now, Rona says they're dropping like flies. All of them express their fears. And really, Rona's only been here one overnight, not even. So it makes sense that she is the most frightened. Buffy tells them Giles and Anya will be back soon, hopefully with information. Sandra reasonably suggests they need a plan B. Buffy apologizes for asking, but appeals to Willow, and Willow says she knows they need a magical barrier. Buffy is guessing the Ubervamp doesn't need an invite to get in. Willow says she'll try, and Rona says try. Kennedy snaps at Rona. This is one of a few things I like about Kennedy in this episode. I am not a Kennedy fan, and there are a number of reasons why that I think will come out later. But on this really close look, I am seeing more about her that I like and that I wish maybe had been emphasized a little more, because much as Kennedy made light of Willow's magic, and she isn't, I think even later, really taking in what Willow's trying to tell her, she immediately jumps in there and defends Willow when Rona is mad that Willow just says, try, she'll try. And earlier, as I said, Kennedy was the only one who's like, yeah, fight. Let's go. I'm ready to fight. That's not to say the others are flawed. Kennedy is supposed to be a bit older. She's clearly someone who enjoys the idea of battling and fighting. She wants to try her skills, and we'll see later that she has used a crossbow before. These are things I didn't really notice the first time around, and I like that about her. Chloe now says, what if the barrier doesn't work? Rona can't see how they'll fight. They all question if the Buffy couldn't beat the Turok Han, how can they? As they go on and on, freaking out more and more, Buffy looks at Willow. Willow returns the glance, and the two get up and leave the room. Xander says, "What?" and then follows them into the kitchen. They stand there and look at one another in silence. It seems like they are just listening to the potentials, but we'll find out later there's more to it. At 26 minutes, 22 seconds, we're back at the cave. The first as Eve sends the Turok Han out to get the potentials. She tells it to take them all, quote, except for her, end quote. Then she turns into Buffy, ready to torment Spike again. The bringers gather outside Buffy's house as sunset nears. Buffy hands out weapons. Rona asks what's the point when Buffy hands one to her, and Kennedy tells Rona the point is at this end. You stick it in the bad guys. Any questions? So another example of Kennedy not giving in to this hopelessness idea, not buying into it. Kennedy chooses a crossbow for herself. She says she's been using it since she was 8. Andrew wants a weapon, and Buffy thinks about it and then gives him holy water. Good foreshadowing, as that holy water will show up later, and Andrew, to his credit, seems grateful. Willow coaches herself aloud alone in the hallway through floating a candle. Kennedy walks in and startles her. The candle drops. Willow catches it just in time. Kennedy says, right, she heard about big scary Willow. She'd almost like to see that. But Willow, in a serious voice that sounds a little threatening, says, no, you wouldn't. Willow then tells her about the first getting inside Willow the last time she tried to do magic. It was pure undiluted evil. She could taste it. And we get a little humor as Kennedy says, how's evil taste? And Willow says, a little chalky. Dawn calls them over. She saw the Turok Han out the window, and we cut to commercial. On return, we're about 29 minutes in. The Turok Han bangs on the door. Willow's eyes go black as she says a spell. She's trying to keep that magic barrier strong. It works at first, but Willow is really struggling as the Turok Han gets into the house and pushes against the barrier. It looks about to fail, and Buffy tells them all to run. They go out the back door. Kennedy shoots one of the bringers, and the others fight, and some of them run. This is one of the challenges with the first. It is so strong, yet in this scene, its bringers don't manage to kill any of the potentials. And I don't think we ever learn, minor spoilers, whether it can just make new bringers any time. The bringers, we saw something in an earlier episode, I believe, where it can kind of make bringers out of human beings, and then they're not human anymore because Spike can fight them. But it is not clear. Can it just create bringers whenever it wants? If so, why doesn't it just have wave after wave of them to send in? It's okay if it doesn't, but it would help if we knew what sort of limits the first have, because instead it just feels kind of convenient that these bringers are really scary and yet they are somewhat easily defeated right here. Inside the house, the Turok Han finally breaks through that magical barrier. The scene cuts to Giles and Anya. So that was a great example of something very dramatic happening in one part of the storyline, and then a cut to another part. And that's really important because this other part is a little bit more exchanging information. It's not as action-oriented. It's not action-oriented at all. So that is a nice way to weave together your sort of quieter scenes with the more action scenes by cutting at that moment, and it keeps the tension high while we learn more information. Giles and Anya emerge from that portal. Anya says she doesn't get it. Buffy died before, and it didn't let the first act this way. Another question that the audience likely has. Giles responds that the eye was clear. It's because Buffy lives again, not because she died. And here we get some genuine conflict because Anya, distraught, says, oh, they did it. She, Willow, Tara, and Xander, they're responsible. They brought Buffy back. And that's why the first was there and the girls were murdered. The world would have been better off if Buffy stayed dead. Now, the beginning of season 6 with that demon gang suggests that's not true, but I can definitely see why Anya feels that way at this time. One question that is not answered, but I think it's okay, is why didn't this occur? Because Buffy was brought back from the dead in season 1 as well at the end. My headcanon is that's because the Slayer line worked as it should. Buffy died, Kendra was called. So even though Buffy came back and was alive, her death triggered another Slayer. Kendra's death then triggered Faith. When Buffy died a second time, as far as we know, it didn't trigger another Slayer. And that was probably okay. So for purposes of the line, Buffy was dead and stayed dead in a way because it went Buffy, Kendra, Faith. But this time, Buffy dies again, which isn't a problem according to the eye. But now she comes back, and having already triggered these next two Slayers, her coming back this time throws everything off. She's now outside of the line of succession. She's alive, but she's dead. So I can see there's enough of a distinction there, and it's probably okay that we don't go into the weeds and explain that. That's pretty technical, and I think there's enough of a difference in what happens in season 1 and season 5, or technically 6, when Buffy comes back, that you could come up with any number of reasons why that opened an opportunity for the first. Also not answered is, well, why didn't it do this in season 6? My headcanon is the first is ever present. It's always been, always will be. So for the first, a season or a year is like a blip, a day. I can imagine it was just gathering forces or sorting out what to do. Another question that Exchange does answer is, why does the first is Eve say don't kill Buffy yet? And that's it, because Buffy has to be killed last because she's the one who makes this opening for the first possible. So to wipe out the Slayer line, the first has to be empowered by Buffy being alive. Then once it's wiped out all the potentials and Faith, it can take out Buffy and no more Slayers. The scene cuts back to the Turok Han. The group has gotten away from the Bringers, but the Turok Han is coming, and Buffy tells them to split up. She'll fight and distract the Turok Han, and she tells Willow and Xander to get the potentials, Dawn and Andrew to a safe spot. On first watch, this seemed like such a bad idea to me, which somebody says, and not like Buffy. We understand later why she does it. It's all part of her plan. But I think it's part of why I didn't love this episode the first time as I watched it until we got to the scene where Buffy finally fights the Turok Han. I have some exciting news to share. The most recent QC Davis crime novel, The Forgotten Man, was just named a 5-star reader's favorite. And it is my favorite of my novels because it's the most recent one, so I always love the newest one the most. Here's what it's about. Her sister's death has haunted her entire life. Lawyer Quill C. Davis is determined to solve the cold case murder of her sister. Shortly after Quill's sister went missing almost 40 years ago, her body turned up in a grave with another little girl. The killer was never found. Quill's parents were devastated and never fully recovered from the loss, made even more tragic because they are still the lead suspects in both murders. Now, after investigating other crimes successfully, Quill turns to her sister's cold case, delving deep into a web of deceit that stretches back decades. Someone is bent on stopping her at any cost, but Quill vows to make her parents proud and bring them peace. Even if it means putting herself in danger, she'll stop at nothing to achieve justice. But will Quill find the killer or become the next victim? Filled with twists and turns, The Forgotten Man is a page-turning mystery that will keep you guessing until the very end. You can find it at your local library or follow the links on my author website, lisalilly.com. You can also watch the book trailer on my website or on patreon.com/LisaMLilly. Buffy takes Andrew's holy water and he says, "Hey, I need that." I never noticed that before, so I think that's really cool because she is going to use it. And on all my other watches, I just thought Buffy had brought it with her, which would be sort of odd that that's the only weapon she brings. So I like that she gave it to Andrew, probably knowing she was going to use it. Xander more or less has to drag Dawn with him. She wants to stay with Buffy. And now we are at the 3/4 turn, which should grow from the midpoint and take the story in yet another new direction and raise the stakes further. Here, this comes out of that reversal of Buffy feeling the first had the upper hand. It did have the upper hand. The others had no faith. Now Buffy's plan is really taking hold. She made a plan. Now it is spinning toward her battle with the Turok Han. She attacks it. It shoves her away pretty easily. She smashes the holy water in its face. It does seem to hurt the Turok Han. Buffy runs, wanting it to follow her, and it doesn't. She tries to go back and get it to because it's running off the other direction, but it does not have any interest in her. The scene cuts to Xander, who leads everyone into a construction site. There's a lot of scaffolding up. It's a partly built building, really set up in a U, almost like an arena. Kennedy says this is crazy. Rona asks what they're doing there. Xander tells them it's the site of the future public library. Willow tells them to spread out. They hold on to their weapons. Rona says the Turok Han is going to kill Buffy and then come after them. Kennedy, who is staring straight ahead, says, or it could just skip that part and come straight here. And she does falter a tiny bit at the end, but she has her crossbow ready. And we see what she saw, that the Turok Han growling is already there. We cut to a commercial. Kennedy readies to shoot, and Chloe says, "Oh, no, 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 no." At 34 minutes, 33 seconds, the floodlights go on. Buffy is there. Willow stops Kennedy from shooting the Turok Han and tells her and the others, "Just watch, it's showtime." That line, "It's showtime," echoes the demon in the musical saying that. Buffy tells the Turok Han, doesn't this all look good to him? All these trapped girls, they can do nothing but wait. That's all they've done for days. Wait to be picked off, dreaming of monsters that can't be killed. But Buffy doesn't believe in that. She always finds a way, and she says, I'm the thing that monsters have nightmares about. And right now, you and me are going to show them why. It's time. Welcome to Thunderdome, a reference to the movie Mad Max Beyond the Thunderdome. And Andrew says, 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. A quote from that movie. It is an intense battle. Turok Han is beating Buffy badly. The others watch, really frightened. Buffy is knocked back. Dawn says to Willow, you planned this, letting the barrier fail, bringing us here, you and Buffy. And we get a flashback to that dining room table discussion. Buffy, when she gives Willow that look, we hear her voice speaking to Willow telepathically. Buffy saying something about, I need these girls to trust me. We've got to do something. And asking for Willow to follow her. Willow gets up and telepathically tells Xander to follow them into the kitchen. And Xander aloud says, what? In the kitchen, still telepathically, they have a conversation. Buffy says she has to kill the Ubervamp and the girls need to see her do it. Xander says he knows just the place. Here is an example of inconsistent world building. Not inconsistent completely, because we did see Willow use telepathy before. I'm not sure that's the exact word, because that would be reading someone's thoughts, but it is communication, mental communication. She used it to talk to Spike in the end of season 5. She uses it at the beginning of season 6 to direct the friends in Buffy's absence when she's up above the graveyard. And later in season 6, I'm pretty sure she uses it. But maybe what I'd say is convenient world building, because there are many other times it might have come in handy and Willow doesn't use it. So it is used when it would be handy. And on one of the DVD commentaries or interviews, I don't remember which one, the writers commented on that and said, this power kind of comes and goes when we need it. All the same, I completely went with it for this episode because I like the results. And that's an example of the emotion of this climax hits me and of Buffy's triumph. So I don't care that maybe it's a little convenient to suddenly Willow remembers she can talk to people, or Buffy remembers she could talk to Willow this way. That's the other question. I don't know that we've ever seen another character initiate it. Willow has started the talking in their heads. We've never seen another character just be like, oh, hey, I could talk to Willow this way. The scene cuts back to the present. We are now in the climax where the opposing forces have their final clash and resolve the conflict. The clash here, the antagonist and protagonist here, are the First and Buffy. But in this instance, because we have an entity as the antagonist and it's incorporeal, the Turok Han is standing in for the First, but really Buffy's antagonist for the episode is the First as a whole, coming to her in different guises, coming to her as Eve, presenting as Eve, coming to her as the Turok Han. And now to defeat the First for this episode, she has to defeat the Turok Han and prove something in a way that encourages the potentials. Buffy uses the crossbow, she uses pipes, she uses an axe, and the Turok Han keeps getting the better of her. It kicks her when she's on the ground. It throws her up into a wooden platform that breaks. It advances and grabs her by the throat, growling, and Rona says it's killing her. Willow tells them to wait, though she looks nervous too. After all, this is really well built up to in the previous episodes. The Turok Han won the last battle and nearly killed Buffy. Buffy, though, pulls the arrow that she shot earlier into the Turok Han's chest. She pulls it out, sticks it in his eye, and that hurts him enough that he lets go. She gets in some really good kicks and punches and throws him to the ground. They fight more. He gets dizzy, spins around. Buffy grabs a wire, wraps it around the Turok Han's neck from behind, and yanks and decapitates it. It turns to dust. And Buffy, bruised and battered, wipes the dust from her hands as she turns to the potentials. See dust, just like the rest of them. I don't know what's coming next, but I do know it's going to be just like this. Hard, painful. But in the end, it's going to be us. If we all do our parts, believe it, we'll be the ones left standing. Here endeth the lesson. For this episode, Buffy has prevailed against the First. And we see that as Kennedy smiles, telling us her message got through, her lesson got through to the potentials, and she now leads the newly confident potentials back home. We're in the falling action where we tie up loose ends, resolve subplots, and sometimes set up later episodes. The First, as Eve, watches from above as Buffy leads the Slayers, the potential Slayers, away, looking very unhappy. It reminds me of the Anointed One in a similar position, watching after Buffy smashed the Master's bones. Buffy's line, here endeth the lesson, according to the BuffyFandom.com wiki, has been said 2 other times in the series. First, in Never Kill a Boy on the First Date by the Master, and second, in Fool for Love by Spike. Speaking of Spike, he is still chained up in the cage. He sees Buffy coming toward him with a bringer's knife in her hand, and he thinks it's the First. He says, a knife now, is it? What'll that? You can't hurt me. You're just a bloody figment, you are. You're just... But Buffy cuts away his bonds. It is really her. Spike wraps his arms around her, and she helps him stagger out of the cage. And that is it for the episode, other than foreshadowing. If you found the way I talk about story and plot helpful and want to try it with your own writing, you can download free story structure worksheets at writingasasecondcareer.com/worksheets. If you're not sticking around for the foreshadowing section, which does include spoilers, thank you so much for listening, and a special thank you to patrons who support the podcast. Come back in 2 weeks for Season 7, Episode 12, Potential, where Buffy begins training the potentials in earnest, and Dawn discovers she might have a calling. And we are back for foreshadowing. This episode sets up Storyteller, where Andrew finally grapples with his guilt over killing Jonathan. Dawn says Spike was controlled by the First, and Andrew will try adopting that as a story, that the First controlled him. And Dawn says that maybe you shouldn't have killed your only friend. And that reminds us, and more important, Andrew, that he has not dealt with that. And that is what the entire Storyteller episode is about. And that is the only one that is from Andrew's point of view. Beljax's eyes prophecy about the Slayer line ending is something we've already stated is part of the First's goal. Buffy has speculated on that, and this confirms and foreshadows that, yes, that is where this is going. And what I love is it foreshadows the very end of the series, because the Slayer line does end in the sense that there's no more potentials, there's no more one Slayer has to die for the next to be activated, also talked about specifically in this episode. That ends. So the Slayer line does end, but not the way that Giles and the audience are thinking. And that is often the way oracles work in the Buffyverse. In Season 1, there was the prophecy about Buffy facing the Master and dying, and she did do that, and she did die, but she came back. And the Master tells her prophecies are tricky because if she never came down beneath to try to kill the Master and defeat the prophecy, he could never have risen. So it's always in the Buffyverse a kind of warning about buying into prophecies, because the wording can always be tricky. Oh, and of course, the huge one in Angel, the Shanshu prophecy, where Wesley translates it that it means Angel will die, but ultimately it means he'll become human, because humans can live and can die. So there's always some sort of a twist with the prophecies, and this one sets up yet another. There's a lot here with the potentials foreshadowing everyone turning on Buffy. Buffy tells Rona she'll be safer with Buffy around next time she's attacked, and Rona's shock at that and her other comments in this episode, her fright, her anger that Willow is just going to try to do a spell, set up that Rona is one of the ones who loses the most, or maybe never had confidence in Buffy. And in the episode where they all kick Buffy out, she says Buffy is reckless. She's not, I wouldn't say the leader in kicking Buffy out, but she is a strong voice in support of that. And that is well set up here from her very first moments in Sunnydale. Buffy getting the names wrong, it does a couple things. One is I feel like it does kind of reassure us that maybe it's okay that we can't remember their names, that is part of what is happening here. So many new potentials. And it foreshadows that Buffy is not going to get better at this. And when Faith appears and Faith takes them all out, and then they're wanting Faith to take over, and Buffy says something like, well, I should have a chance to buy them drinks and basically campaign. And Faith says, learn their names, because Faith does know their names, and it highlights that Buffy has not done that. And she later will tell Spike she didn't want to because she knew some of them would die. It is too hard for her to deal with that. And this is the beginning of that. Buffy just feels she cannot connect to these girls because she, deep in her heart, feels she won't be able to protect them. And if they are going to win this battle and this war, the only way she sees is this huge fight where they are going to, at least some of them, get killed. And I hope I remember to talk about when we get there that the answer is not to treat them as sort of cannon fodder, because Spike says, not unrealistically, that is part of war. There are always casualties. And Buffy says, casualties, even the word sounds so casual. She has trouble with that idea that you basically are going to sacrifice some soldiers. And her answer is to make them all slayers. That doesn't save all of them, but it does take them from being kind of, oh, these are our front lines that we can lose, or I don't know enough about war. Maybe it's not your front lines, but whoever it is you sent in that you're like, well, these are the ones where we just sent in a ton of people and we're going to lose some of them. She turns them into slayers who at least have a good chance. On that same topic, Chloe worries about being the next Slayer. She feels she's too young. Her name is the one that Buffy mistakenly calls Eve. And when Chloe says, oh, no, 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 at the arena, I notice she is wearing a shirt with a lamb on it. And it made me think of A Lamb to the Slaughter, because Chloe is the one that the first will talk into ending her own life. So heavily foreshadowed here. I have to think that lamb was not accidental. At the very least, the costume designers had to have been generally thinking of the lamb to the slaughter idea, whether or not they knew that Chloe was going to die. Buffy pulling that arrow out of the Turok Han's chest and sticking it in its eye, which gives her an advantage and turns the tide of momentum. Xander will later say when they go to face Caleb to go for the eyes, that everything has an eye, that it's very vulnerable. And then Caleb destroys Xander's eye. This whole storyline with Eve being there for a couple days and they didn't notice foreshadows their concerns about Giles later, because Giles has been there longer than that. And I find it hard to believe that no one can remember hugging him, touching him. I've said before, it feels weird that Giles never puts a hand on anyone's shoulder, because Giles, I think, would do that. This thing of Eve being there and they didn't notice, though, makes it understandable why, or sets up their fears about Giles, because they didn't pick up on it before. So maybe as they think about it, someone might think, well, I think that I saw Giles touch something, but we didn't notice with Eve. Eve also highlights some of the challenges of the first as a big bad that we'll see through the season. A lot of things are not quite clear. For instance, does the first have to manifest as someone to learn about what Buffy's doing? It seems to be this all-powerful evil force, so it seems odd that it can't just sort of listen in, that it has to be there. I would have liked to see that specifically laid out, and it never is. We never really find out about that. And the other challenge is generally the incorporeal nature of the first. It always needs to act through others, like the Turok Han, and later Caleb. And that's challenging. I feel like the show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., so spoilers for that, skip ahead if you don't want to hear, takes this idea and it works better. There is a force, I want to say season 3, where it is both a monster that is able to become corporeal by taking over an actual dead body. So it has a physical form, it can shift that, and it also ultimately can turn into its own physical form, which ends up being a little goofy looking. It's like an octopus head with legs. But before that, it is formidable and scary. It's kind of this shadowy, scary figure. It has a body in that sense of those dead bodies, and it is able to take over other people in a different way. It's called Hive eventually, and it is able to get its own either parts of its biology or chemistry into a person and kind of take over their mind. So there's still themselves, but they want to be with Hive and be part of it, and it makes them feel really good, and they do all these things they wouldn't otherwise do. And it makes it scarier, and it gives Hive a way to act, and you don't have what we have here, which is a lot of the time the first is appearing as a dead person but has no body. So Buffy calls this out toward the end of the season in that its main power is taunting. It's messing with people's heads, and it doesn't, in my opinion, do that super well. This episode is probably the best example where Eve, the first as Eve, does this and really throws off the potential slayers. Other than that, our friends now know, so it kind of did it in conversations with dead people, but they figured it out. Willow figured it out. Never clear if Joyce was the first, but it doesn't quite work. All the same, I'm really impressed that Buffy tackled that idea of this kind of very different season antagonist. That is it for the foreshadowing. Thank you again for listening. Come back in 2 weeks for episode 12 of season 7, Potential, where Buffy doubles down on training the potentials, and Dawn thinks she might be one of them. You can find back episodes of Buffy and the Art of Story, as well as the Buffy and the Art of Story books and all my fiction at lisalilly.com. To support the podcast, hear extra bonus content, and get each regular episode a few days early, join the Patreon community at patreon.com/LisaMLilly. That's Lisa, M as in Marie, Lilly. Music for this episode was written and performed by Robert Newcastle. Buffy and the Art of Story is a production of Spiny Woman, LLC. Copyright 2024. All rights reserved.